Hey guys, welcome back to DCS World. I'm Spudknocker, as always, and today we're going to take a look at setting up your HOTAS and key bindings for the F-14B Tomcat by Heatblur. So because we're getting an F-14B from the circa 1996-1997 timeframe, there's a couple really interesting little facts about the lantern pod that we're carrying. The early lantern pods that were bought by the US Navy for use on the F-14 had a ceiling restriction of about 25,000 feet due to the laser receiver, which is analogous to like the LST in an AV-8, having a tendency to arc and spark, quote-unquote, above 25,000 feet at low pressures. This arcing and sparking would of course lead to a fire within the pod, and due to the fact that it is not jettisonable, because it's super expensive and not really that heavy, the fire would spread to the rest of the aircraft and lead to a total airframe loss, relegating the F-14's carrying lantern pods to about a 25,000 foot ceiling. Now in the wake of 9/11 and the start of Operation Enduring Freedom, this made Tomcat operations over the very high and hot areas of Afghanistan very difficult for F-14 Tomcat crews. It limited their weapons firing solutions, as well as put them more into the field of fire of Taliban SAM systems. So kind of a cool little fact there. And growing up in Southern California, the F-14 is certainly extremely near and dear to my heart, and is just like, what can you say? It's an F-14. It's just so cool. Heatblur has done a fantastic job, and it is something that you have not flown anything like it in DCS World. When it comes to you guys, just keep an open mind out there, and just know that it's going to be a completely different and new experience, something that you've never experienced before. It's not like the F-15, it's not like the F-18, it's not like the Harrier, it's not like any airplane in DCS World at the moment. In fact, I would wager that pilots who have been concentrating on warbirds in DCS will have a leg up on everyone else when flying the F-14, due to the fact that it is such a stick and rudder heavy aircraft. So a lot of content creators have focused on showing off the really cool aspects of the F-14, but something that we all need is the key bindings and your HOTAS setup. So that's what I'm going to do here for you guys today, is we're going to take a look at how I've set up my HOTAS, and how you guys can set up your HOTAS in the future to get you guys going as quickly as possible in the F-14. So without further ado, let's go ahead and step into the office and get started. Alrighty, now that we're back in the office, we can go ahead and hit the escape key, go to adjust controls, and first we'll go ahead and take a look at all the buttons and functions on the stick of the F-14. Now do know that Heatblur has stated that they will come out with key bindings for all of the major joysticks, but first are coming out with the Warthog. I personally have the Logitech X56 HOTAS. It's a bit of a cheaper one, about half the price of a Warthog, but for my purposes, it works just fine. So all of these key bindings are key bindings you are going to want to bind to your HOTAS in some form, so you don't have to have necessarily an X56 to benefit from this video. You can simply follow along and make sure you bind the same functions and buttons to your HOTAS, which for whatever stick or HOTAS solution you deem is right for you. So first thing we'll take a look at is we will squeeze the trigger on my stick, and it'll bring us right to the trigger selection here. Of course, you guys know what the trigger does. It simply fires any forward firing weapons in the F-14 Tomcat, be it guns, Sparrows, Sidewinders, Zuni rockets that are attached for air to ground, anything like that would be firing forward. Next function we're going to go for is the stores release. That is on our button 2, of course, and Store's Release does the same thing as the trigger for anything that is dropping off of the aircraft. Not a forward-firing weapon, but something dropping off the aircraft, whether it be a bomb or any other kind of store. Next, of course, we have the start into the flight control systems. Here is the trims buttons. So we need trim up, down, left wing down, and right wing down, of course. Always very important. In the F-14 Tomcat, you're going to want to be trimming this girl out constantly. Thankfully, though, like the AV-8B Harrier, throwing the F-14 into autopilot mode will in fact auto trim out for pitch. However, it will not auto trim out for roll like it does in the AV-8B Harrier. So just keep that in mind for future reference. Definitely going to need to have these trim hats definitely bound to your HOTAS. Next, we've got the DLC toggle and countermeasure dispense button. I have that down by my thumb on my stick. Very important for countermeasures dispensing. You know, you're diving in on a target to drop some bombs, and you see a man pad coming up at you. You gotta pump out some flares super quickly. Maybe Jester or your Rio, human Rio, didn't see it yet, and you saw it, so you gotta get those flares out quick. Likewise, same thing for a dogfight. Also super important to have this button close to your thumb on your stick when you're in the groove for a carrier landing to get your DLC out. These little flaps and speed brakes that pop up out of the top of your wings to decrease lift in the F-14, because with the big tunnel and those big straight wings on approach to the carrier or approach to a runway, you get a ton of lift, and it's actually very difficult to put her down onto the runway, which is the opposite problem you have in the F-18, where she just wants to fall out of the sky with any throttle movement, right? So to toggle that, or to dispense these switches, press this button, and then the next, of course, would be the thumb wheel aft and forward. So the DLC thumb wheel, I of course don't have a stick that mimics an F-14 stick, so it's not in fact a wheel. I actually bound them to the same hat switch that I used for my center select switch in the AV-8 or the F-18. Up for forward, down for aft, and this simply pops those spoilers out and then brings them back in. So forward pops them out, aft brings them back in, and allows you to fine-tune how much drag you're putting onto the aircraft as you come into the groove to snag a wire or onto your runway. Next thing that relates to the countermeasure dispense button and DLC toggle is your ECM Jam Toggle. I actually have that out where I would normally have my flares button for the F-18, but this works just as well. I haven't used this one yet, but I know that I'm going to definitely need it in the future. Next thing is going to be our weapon select hat, which I have to my POV hat at the moment. Very important because, like I said, we don't have a stick that mimics the F-14 exactly. On my X56 here, I'd have it on my POV hat, like I said, and down for gun, to the side for sidewinders, up for Sparrow and or Phoenix missiles, and to the right for weapon selector off. Now you may be wondering, why do I need to bind weapon selector off? Well, if you're rolling in on a target, getting ready to drop some bombs, you need to tell the weapons computer of the aircraft to ignore air-to-air weapons and tell it to pick up the air-to-ground weapons. And by turning the weapon selector off, that is actually how you select your air-to-ground weapons. Of course, you need to talk to Jester or talk to your Rio for him to actually, or her, to actually select which air-to-ground weapon the aircraft sensors and systems are going to pick up when you turn weapon select off. Now, something that I also haven't used yet is weapon selector press. I actually have that bound with a modifier. If you need to add a modifier, super easy. I actually have button 5 on my X56 HOTAS, which is down next to the brake lever button. If you need to add a modifier and you haven't done so yet, just simply go down to modifiers, hit add modifier, and wherever you want it to be, if you want it on your throttle, if you want it on your stick, choose that, and then simply press that button that you want, and you'll be good to go. I already have one on there, so we'll just go ahead and leave it now, the way it is now, of course. Alrighty, so we got the trim has nose wheel steering and nose wheel steering toggle. Super important one, especially when you're on the carrier deck. Say you've just come in for a trap and you've got to clear the deck as quickly as possible. Toggle your nose wheel steering and get off and have a clear deck for the next aircraft coming in. Very important there. Also very important is I actually have a modifier to the same button for the autopilot emergency disconnect paddle. So if you're in autopilot and you've got a bandit rearing down on you that you didn't see, came out of the sun or something like that, you need to disconnect autopilot really quickly. Go ahead and press that guy and you're good to go. So that would be it for the stick options here in the F-14. So why don't we go ahead and move on to the throttle buttons and functions. So the first couple of functions that I have toggled to my throttle are the three little switches that are down below underneath the throttle on the X56. As a content creator, I like to use the external views quite a lot, and just because it's a game, you know, it looks so beautiful outside the aircraft, it's good to take a look once in a while. So I have my F1 cockpit view bound, I have my F2 aircraft view bound, I also have ground unit view bound as well. I don't use that one so much when I'm actually flying and recording. I use that one more for when I'm doing video recording work in a replay. I also have chase view mapped. Don't use that one too often, but it's still kind of cool to have it mapped. Released weapon view is one that I used a lot, especially in my tutorial videos to show what the weapon that we've just fired or dropped has done. And that is it for views. One thing to note about my F1 cockpit view, something that I think is super important, is my F1 cockpit view is also dual mapped to my track IR center view. You can also dual map it to your VR center view if you want. But what's really nice about that is if you're outside the aircraft looking around at something, you know, marveling something, and then you've got a bandit coming up at you and you need to get back in the cockpit view really quickly and make your track IR centered, you just hit the same button and it does both for you at the same time. You're in your cockpit, your track IR is centered, and you're good to go. Alrighty, next thing would be labels. Also, as a content creator, I also bind my labels to my HOTAS to pop them on, pop them off when we need to, you know, say if we're flying towards the target and I'm talking and we don't want labels, but then once we get to the target area and we're doing, you know, I want you guys to see where those targets are in the video, I'll pop the labels back on. So I actually have a modifier for the labels to the same switches that I did for the view. So that's that joystick button 5 combined with one of those switches below the throttle for all labels, aircraft labels, and vehicle and ship labels, so I can kind of mix and match to make the video look as good as possible while also being able to see things in the environment as well. Next thing that's also modified to those switches down below the throttle on my X56 is going to be kneeboard on-off. Very important, especially here in the Tomcat, because there's a lot of really cool information you can find on the kneeboard. Of course, including the good old carrier landing grading system that Heatblur has come up with, which is very cool. That's for sure. So kneeboard on-off, as well as kneeboard current position mark, is also on my HOTAS as well. So that's good for navigating in, you know, a P-51 or some aircraft that doesn't have much of a navigation suite to it. I just kept that here for the F-14 because why not? We'll just keep things as you know, as uniform as possible across all of my modules to make it easy to swap back and forth, which as a content creator is super important because I want to show off different airplanes to you guys at home. So that's pretty much it for kneeboard, labels, and views, and all that kind of admin kind of stuff. So let's get back into actual F-14 stuff. We've got the pilot lock-on button, which I actually bind to my TDC depress button for my other aircraft, and holding this button while you're in a dogfight will allow the AUG-9 radar in the F-14 to lock up a bandit that's right in front of you, kind of like a bore sight mode or an ACM mode in like your F-18. Next is our Sidewinder cage scene button. We have that down below on button 3 for the throttle, and that is to change your Sidewinder from white acquisition to a cage seam acquisition mode. As you get into the F-14 and start playing with it, you guys will get a better idea of what this does. Next, we have Autopilot Toggle, which is modified to the cage seam button. Like I said, definitely have a modifier. It makes things a lot easier when it comes to creating profiles for your HOTAS. Autopilot's super important, like I said, because it automatically trims out in the pitch for the speed that you're at, which is very, very nice. It helps you trim it out in case you after a dogfight and your trim is all messed up. Just throw it into autopilot mode and your trim will be pretty much set and ready to go for cruising out to your next objective or your next navigation point or wherever you're going. Next thing that is super, super important is the gesture toggle menu. So we can see gesture AI here and toggle menu. This is very important because this is how you bring up gestures menu, and when you look with your track IR or your VR to this correct thing on the radio wheel, if you press it again, it will select that option, or if you look back to the center and you press it again, you can get rid of the gesture menu. Something super important that you're going to use in the F-14 every single flight, all the time. So I actually have that mapped right underneath my ring finger as my hand sits on my X56 HOTAS, which is very, very important. Next thing, we've got toggle auto throttle. Now, some people may think that in the F-14 this is something you're not going to use very often, but for me, doing a lot of training with people and doing a lot of Wingman Finder videos where I'm usually a flight lead and usually kind of orchestrating the whole strike package, auto throttle is very important so that I can keep a very nice, steady speed for my wingmen as they're flying along with me. Next thing would be night vision goggles toggle. Night vision goggles, super important, especially if you're flying at night. I have that modified to my gesture menu button, so it's right underneath my my ring finger, not wingman finger. I just hit that, and we're good to go. Pop up the night vision goggles, and you're good. Next thing would be wing sweep hat switch. This is super important, and because I have an X56 throttle, what's very, very cool and very nice is there's two hat switches, 8-way hat switches right next to my thumb when it's sitting on the throttle. So we can see that we need to have 4 different switches mapped to our HOTAS. We've got wing swept aft, wing swept forward, wing swept auto, which is up on the hat switch, and bomb mode, which would be down. Now, of course, these things are pretty easy to figure out what they do. Wing sweep aft is manually sweeping the wings aft into a more swept position. Forward sweeps them forward for a more low speed handling configuration. Auto mode, pop it up to allow the computer of the jet to simply sweep the wings based on airspeed, AOA, other factors like altitude and airspeed, things like that. Bomb mode is you press that down and puts the wing sweep into a good configuration for a very nice weapon separation for LGBs, for very precise bombing. One thing that's very cool about the F-14 is it's probably the most accurate and best bomber in DCS world, in my opinion, and far outpaces the accuracy and bombing that the F-18 has. So it's very, very interesting in that way, and it's going to be a really good fighter as well as a fantastic bomber here in DCS. Okay, so the next thing that we have here is speed brakes on and off. So we've got speed brake extend, which is mapped to my little thumb switch here. Super important for when you're approaching the carrier, approaching a runway in a dogfight. You need to bleed some speed really quick. Very important. Of course, retracting them is also very important. You don't want to accidentally leave those guys out. Unfortunately, because it's not a 2-position switch on the X56, I actually have to modify that thumb switch to bring them back in. So what I do is I put my thumb forward to extend them, I quickly bring it back, and then when I'm ready to bring the speed brakes back in and stow them, I simply hit my modifier, bring my thumb up again, and retract them. Very easy to explain. If you have any aviation knowledge, you guys know what a speed brake is. Next thing we have is wheel brakes. That's very important too, especially if you're on the carrier. Can't tell you how many Wingman Finder guys I've watched taxi off the deck of the carrier, so make sure your wheel brakes are bound. I don't really need the toe brakes for wheel brakes left and right bound. I just need the wheel brakes both bound. So that is the little flat button also next to my thumb on my HOTAS here, on the X56 HOTAS. Next thing we're going to take a look at is exterior lights on and off. Something that's a little bit confusing in the F-14 is if you flip your external light switches to the on position, they won't come on. You actually have to turn the master exterior lights on-off switch on. So I actually have that modified to that same little wheel brakes button right next to my thumb. You cannot map both on and off onto that same thing, so I also have a little switch down below to the side of the throttle for on and off mapped as well. So if I need to surprise a hijacked Libyan or Egyptian airliner over the Mediterranean, when we get the Israeli map, we'll go ahead and use that. So let's take a look at the last couple things here, is some bindings that I've actually changed on the keyboard from the default bindings that are on the keyboard. There's a lot of modifiers and, right control something, left control something, all these, alts, shifts, all these kinds of things, but there's a couple we can very much simplify. The first thing that's really important is the mic button for UHF-1, the ARC 159, and the mic button for UHF-2, ARC 182. Because in my Wingman Finder missions and in a lot of the single-player missions I fly with easy comms off. It's very important to have both of these mapped because you can't just use the communication window. You have to use the correct radio at the correct frequency. And so to keep this as simple as possible and keep it sort of in line with my Harrier and AV8 key bindings, I have my left and right bound to the left and right keyboard buttons, arrow buttons on my keyboard. Left is UHF-1 and right is UHF-2. Very similar to how on like the F-18, the radio 1 is on the left side, radio 2 is on the right side, same with the Harrier. Next thing I also changed the keyboard binding to is the pause button. There's nothing bound to P, so I cleared that and I put in P. Just makes sense to me to hit P for pause. You can of course do anything you want. L for flashlight. Usually this is bound to left Alt L. However, that's kind of, takes a lot of fumbling around to find that if you need a flashlight now to find something in your cockpit that you're not totally familiar with. So I just take away the Alt and just keep it L. Very simple, very easy to use. And the last thing on your keyboard that you really need to have bound, especially if you're going to be flying at night, is your NVG goggles gain up and down. I simply put this to my arrow keys up and arrow keys down. Looks like I didn't clear out the original key bindings for those, so why don't we go ahead and do that now and just redo this. We'll add down, clear, and add up, and we're good to go there. And that makes it a little bit simpler looking here on the key bindings menu. So as you can see, there's not a ton of things you have to bind for the F-14 for the pilot seat, but it's definitely not trivial. I think it is actually a little bit less than you would have to bind for your F-18 or your AV-8, and that's simply because you've got a guy in the back doing a lot of heavy lifting with the sensors. So in the future, when I'm a little bit better in the Rio cockpit, I will go ahead and do another video on my key bindings for the Rio cockpit. But for now, this should get you guys going in the F-14, and you'll be good to go when it releases on this Wednesday. So, fly safe in the F-14, and happy hunting, guys. Thanks a lot. Make sure you like and subscribe for more F-14 content coming in the future. Thanks a lot, guys.